When a wounded Cheyenne girl was left to die alone on the plains, it seemed her story would end in silence and dust. The men sent from Fort Buchanan weren't soldiers. They were hired to clear the land, and mercy wasn't part of their orders. But Prospector Jack Callahan made a choice no one expected, carrying her into the heart of danger and standing where no outsider dared. But just wait until you see how this battle turned, and why, in the end, justice stood tall on the ridge. The wind moved slow that evening, dragging dust across the broken Wyoming plain like an old story being whispered again. Jack Callahan rode west, one hand on the reins, the other resting on his thigh, fingers twitching slightly with each hoofbeat. He was alone, not by accident, but by choice. Company for a man like Jack usually meant trouble. The sky ahead was turning amber, melting into darker hues at the edges. He'd been chasing a lead on gold that morning, a claim whispered about in a saloon 2 towns back. But now his mind was on water, not wealth. His canteen was near empty, and his horse's steps were slower than they had been at dawn. He noticed her by the edge of a narrow gully. At first, she looked like a bundle of cloth dropped in the brush, but the color was too rich, too deliberate. Then she moved, barely. A shallow breath lifted her chest. Jack dismounted slowly. Instinct told him this was something he shouldn't step into. But instinct wasn't always the same as conscience. She was young, barely out of childhood, dressed in a beaded deerskin dress worn with care. Her skin was pale with pain, her forehead damp with fever. A wound darkened her side, and her breathing came unevenly. A Cheyenne girl alone and left behind. Jack's eyes swept the ridges. No sound, no sign of riders, no smoke. No footprints except his own. But he knew this wasn't an accident. Someone had left her here, or worse, intended her not to be found at all. He dropped to one knee beside her. "You hear me?" he asked quietly. Her eyes fluttered open, just barely. There was fear in them, and confusion, but not hate. That told him something. He pulled off his outer shirt, folded it, and pressed it gently against the wound. It wasn't deep enough to be fatal if treated soon, but out here, time was the difference between life and silence. He tied the cloth in place with a strip of leather from his saddlebag and glanced once more to the horizon. Jack wasn't a man who saved people. He wasn't a preacher or a sheriff. But that didn't seem to matter now. He slipped one arm under her back, the other under her legs. She was light, thinner than she should have been. As he lifted her, her head dropped against his chest. With one final glance at the dying sun, Jack started walking. He didn't know where her people were, but he knew the old trail that ran through Red Ridge. It would be a long walk. But he had legs, and she had none to use. Behind him, the breeze rustled the sage, and the silence of the plain settled again, as if nothing had changed. But something had. He was carrying more than a stranger. He was carrying a decision that couldn't be undone. Night had nearly fallen when Jack reached the edge of the valley. The slope before him descended into a basin lit by low campfires and shadows dancing across canvas shelters and lean-tos. Smoke rose in thin trails that merged with the cooling dusk. This wasn't just a camp. It was a village prepared to defend itself. He stood on the ridge with the girl still in his arms, her breathing faint but steady. Below, figures turned their heads. At first, only a few noticed. Then as Jack took another step forward, the tension in the air shifted like a bowstring being drawn. A voice cried out in Cheyenne, then another. Movement rippled through the camp like wind through dry grass. Men emerged from tents. Women gathered children and pulled them back. And then, from the rim of the far ridge, metal glinted in the fading light. Rifles. Dozens of them. No sound, no warning. Just the soft shimmer of steel along the rise. They weren't aimed yet, but they didn't need to be. The message was clear. A stranger, especially one carrying a wounded Cheyenne girl, was not welcome here without answers. Jack raised both hands slowly, though one still supported the girl. His voice was calm, but carried across the stillness. "I mean no harm. She was alone. I found her near the creek. Someone left her behind." A man stepped forward from the shadows near the fire, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and braids streaked with gray. His eyes were sharp, his jaw set with the quiet strength of a man used to deciding who lives and who doesn't. He spoke in English, but his tone was carved from stone. "You bring a wounded child to our fire and expect to walk free?" Jack shifted his weight slightly to show he wasn't reaching for anything. "I don't expect anything," he said. I only brought her back alive. That's all I could do." The tension didn't break. More voices came now, some fearful, others furious. Then a child's cry pierced the air. A boy, no older than 10, broke from a group near one of the tents and ran toward them. "Sister!" "That's my sister," he shouted in Cheyenne, then again in halting English. "Sister, she's alive!" Several hands reached to stop him, but the older man raised a hand, and they froze. The boy reached Jack, looked up at the unconscious girl, and then turned back to the others. "It's her. It's Selena." A long silence followed. Then the tall man, clearly a leader, stepped forward and reached gently for the girl. Jack let her go carefully, placing her into the man's arms as the boy clung to her side. Women moved quickly, wrapping her in blankets and whispering soft words to the spirits. Jack stood back, unsure whether to retreat or remain. The man spoke again. "My name is Rushing Wind. I am her uncle. You are fortunate this child lives. But understand, we will not forget that you walked into our home with a rifle on your back." Jack nodded, quiet. "I understand. But that rifle stayed where it was. That's the difference." Rushing Wind studied him for a long moment. Then he gave a short nod and stepped away, carrying Selena toward one of the larger tents. Jack remained standing where he was, alone now, surrounded by warriors who still watched him like a storm they didn't trust to pass. The ridge above remained armed, silent silhouettes against the last light of day, as if the entire mountain held its breath. For now they had chosen not to fire, but it was clear, trust was still a distant thing. And the next choice Jack made would decide whether this valley became a burial ground or a place of understanding. The fire crackled low in the center of the circle. Smoke rose in spirals that wove through the cool night air, carrying the scent of cedar and sage. Jack sat cross-legged, a respectful distance from the inner ring of elders. His shirt was torn, stained from the long walk, and his shoulder ached from carrying her for so many miles, but he made no complaint. Rushing Wind sat across from him, flanked by 2 other men of age and presence. Between them lay a buffalo-hide drum, untouched but symbolic. What passed in this circle would be remembered, whether spoken aloud or carried in silence. For a while, no one said a word. Jack understood. In some places, silence spoke first. Then Rushing Wind broke it with a single question, simple but heavy. "Why did you not leave her?" Jack looked into the fire. He didn't speak right away, not out of hesitation, but to give the words weight. "Because she was still breathing," he said quietly, "and because my sister didn't get that chance." One of the older men raised his brow. The others stilled. Jack continued. "She was young, barely 12, caught between 2 ranches fighting over fencing. No one stopped for her. I came too late." He paused. "I saw that girl near the creek, and I thought, maybe someone should come in time, just once." The fire popped softly. Someone behind him shifted in the shadows, listening. Rushing Wind nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding. "Grief can turn a man bitter," he said, "but you carried yours forward. That is something we honor." One of the elders spoke next, his voice low and steady. "Many would have left her. She is not of your people, but you crossed into fire to bring her back." "I didn't think about people," Jack said. "I just saw a child, alone." For a moment only the wind answered, moving through the tall grass just beyond the circle. Then a new figure stepped forward, the young boy from earlier, Selena's brother. He held something in his hands, a small pouch made of soft leather decorated with red thread. He approached Jack carefully and placed it on the ground before him. "It is not a gift," the boy said. "But it is thanks." Jack met the boy's eyes and gave a small nod. "Then I'll carry it with that meaning." Rushing Wind stood. "You cannot stay in this camp," he said. "Not yet. Many still see you with fear. But you will not leave either. Not tonight." He motioned to a space just outside the fire circle, near a low hill where the night watch kept their posts. "You will sleep near the ridge, among the lookouts. If trouble comes again, you'll see it with us." Jack understood. It was neither exile nor welcome, but it was trust, the beginning of it. He rose without protest and gathered his few things. As he stepped away from the fire, a few of the warriors nodded to him, not as a friend, but not as a stranger either. Before he reached the edge of the camp, he paused and looked back once. Selena's tent stood quiet, a faint glow coming from within. Someone was tending to her. Maybe she would wake by morning. Maybe not. But for the first time in years, Jack didn't feel like he was walking away from something. He was standing beside it. Dawn rose slowly over the high plains, brushing the sky with pale gold. The camp stirred before the sun had fully breached the horizon. Fires were stoked, scouts returned, and eyes were turned east, not toward the morning light, but toward the direction from which danger would come. Jack stood near the ridge with the lookouts wrapped in a blanket offered to him just before first light. He had not asked for it. That made the gesture mean more. Rushing wind joined him in silence. The elder's face was drawn with thought, his gaze distant. "They come from Fort Buchanan," he said after a long pause. "Men paid not to protect, but to clear the land." Jack's jaw tightened. He'd heard of such things. Prospecting companies hiring armed men under false flags, pushing out anyone who stood in the way of a mine or a railroad or a river crossing. "How many?" Jack asked. "Too many," Rushing Wind replied. "But not enough to break our spirit." Below, the camp moved with purpose. Women packed supplies, boys shaped arrows and checked strings. Even the youngest had a task. There was no panic, only preparation. These people had seen trials before. They would face this one standing. Jack found himself walking toward Selena's tent. A woman at the entrance stepped aside, letting him pass without words. Inside, the girl lay pale but awake, her breathing easier now. Her little brother sat at her side, weaving a bracelet with strands of horsehair. When Selena saw Jack, she blinked slowly, recognition flickering in her tired eyes. She said nothing, but the faintest nod passed between them, quiet as a prayer. He didn't stay long. By late afternoon, the sun turned copper and shadows stretched long across the hills. Scouts returned with confirmation. Riders were coming. Dust trails on the horizon, a column of figures too organized for traders and too quick for wanderers. Jack stood once again on the ridge with Rushing Wind and several of the warriors. Some carried hunting rifles, others held long-barreled muskets passed down through generations. Each weapon bore marks of time and care, wrapped in rawhide, inlaid with bone or carved symbols. They weren't soldiers, but they weren't unprepared. Rushing Wind handed Jack a rifle. It wasn't new, but it was oiled and solid. "You've carried your weight," he said. "Now carry this." Jack nodded, accepting it without ceremony. "You sure you trust me with this?" Rushing Wind gave him a look that wasn't exactly a smile, but close enough. "You carried my niece through the dust. We trust actions." As the last light dipped behind the far hills, the ridge filled with silhouettes. Silent, watchful, ready. From below, the invaders would see only the outline of warriors, but not their resolve, not their history, not the reasons they stood. 300 rifles glinted in the final breath of sunlight, like stars above the earth. No battle cry, no threat, just presence. And Jack, once a stranger, stood among them, not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a man who had chosen where he stood when it mattered. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine, dust, and something deeper, the weight of what was about to unfold. The valley was still. Smoke drifted from the last embers along the ridge. The dust had settled, and the sound of hooves, once sharp and urgent, had faded into memory. Evening draped itself over the land like a soft blanket, cooling the heat of the day and washing the camp in gold and shadow. Jack sat alone near the fire, his shoulder wrapped tight. The pain was present, but manageable. It reminded him that he was still here, not by accident, but by choice. Selena sat not far away, a blanket around her shoulders. Her face was pale, but her eyes clear. She hadn't spoken much since the clash ended. She didn't need to. The fact that she was awake, alive, and among her people said enough. Rushing Wind passed by, offering Jack a nod, not of gratitude, but of recognition. A nod shared between two men who had stood back to back when it counted. The boy, Selena's brother, handed Jack the bracelet he'd been weaving. "So you don't forget," he said. Jack tied it on with one hand, looking toward the quiet ridge where the rifles had once glinted like warning stars. The threat was gone. The story, however, would stay. "You leave when you wish," Rushing Wind said. "But if you return, you won't return alone." Jack didn't answer. He looked up at the sky, now filled with stars. He didn't know where he'd go next. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a man running from something. He felt like someone who had finally arrived,